Have you ever felt like a total outsider in a crowded room? Completely disconnected from the buzz of conversation all around you? Well, today, we're going to decode the psychology of social awkwardness and explore why it might actually be a sign of a really intelligent, complex mind. So, let's dive in. There's this idea that the loneliest you can be isn't when you're by yourself. It's when you're in a room jam-packed with people, but the conversation just feels totally empty. It's that feeling of being surrounded by noise, but feeling completely and utterly alone. So have you been there, at a party, maybe, and you're just watching everyone else effortlessly chit-chatting, and you find yourself just mentally checking out? You start wondering, wait, is there something wrong with me? But here's a thought. What if that feeling isn't a flaw at all? What if it's actually a sign that your brain is just wired for a level of depth and, cognitive complexity that most small talk, well, it just can't touch? Okay, think of it like this. Your brain might be running on a totally different social operating system. For most people, small talk is a simple, easy program for building rapport. But for you, it might feel like trying to run some super complex application that just drains your entire mental battery. So for the typical social brain, small talk is a pretty low-effort way to connect. But for what we'll call a deep processing brain, it is mentally exhausting. And that's because it's wired to look for meaning, for new ideas, for structured thought, and honestly, none of that is usually found in chatter about the weather. This means you're not trying to be rude or arrogant when you disengage from that kind of talk. It's that your brain's curiosity system, it just isn't getting the dopamine reward it craves from surface-level stuff. It is literally starving for a conversation with some real substance. So, why does this happen? Well, psychologists have actually pinpointed several key traits that explain this preference for depth. We're going to break down 3 of the biggest ones right now. First up is something called high social sensitivity. Now, this doesn't mean you're just overly emotional. Not at all. It means your nervous system is basically working overtime in social settings. You're not just hearing the words. You're simultaneously processing the tone, you're analyzing the logic, you're sensing all the little emotional shifts. It's an incredibly energy-intensive thing to do. And the direct result of that? Well, when you're putting in that much analytical energy, a surface-level friendship starts to feel like a really bad investment. The cost, in terms of your mental energy, is super high, but the reward, a pretty shallow connection, is very, very low. All right, the second trait is hyperconnectivity. This is the brain's natural tendency to link every tiny little detail to a much larger picture. So while someone is talking about, the weekend's weather, your mind has already jumped from that to global climate patterns, historical trends, maybe even philosophical ideas about humanity's relationship with nature. And this is exactly why those surface-level conversations can feel so frustrating. You're not satisfied with just knowing what happened. Your brain is fundamentally driven to understand the real truth behind the why. You're on a constant search for deeper meaning. Now, the third big trait is having an internal locus of evaluation. You see, most social circles run on external validation. Likes, status, just fitting in. But if this is you, you likely judge yourself by your own internal standards, things like integrity, knowledge, and authenticity. And because you don't need that constant feedback loop of external validation to feel good about yourself, you're just far more willing to be alone. You'd honestly rather wait for a connection that feels genuinely authentic than engage in one that feels, performative, just to be part of the group. This internal drive for authenticity, it naturally leads to rejecting a lot of the social rituals that other people just take for granted. It's about prioritizing a real connection over just going through the motions. Psychologists actually have a name for this, a quality over ritual preference. You might find that forced social events, like those huge birthday parties or obligatory holiday gatherings, they feel kind of artificial and just draining. You'd much rather have one spontaneous, deep conversation on a random Tuesday night. And this brings us to a really key distinction. You're not actually antisocial. You are not avoiding people. You're avoiding the inauthentic, forced performance of socializing that so often comes with those kinds of rituals. A fascinating side effect of all this is what's called cognitive independence. Because you spend less time chasing whatever the trending opinion is or engaging in groupthink, you just naturally develop sharper critical thinking skills. You build your worldview from the ground up based on your own analysis. But of course, there's a social cost to that. This independence makes fitting in a whole lot more difficult. You tend to notice patterns in group behavior or inconsistencies in arguments and social dynamics that other people completely miss.
And honestly, that can make you seem a little distant or maybe even intimidating to some.
But what if we've been looking at this whole thing the wrong way? What if this entire experience isn't a bug, but a feature? Let's try to reframe this, not as a struggle, but as a kind of superpower.
So here's the key takeaway, the big idea. Your mind isn't broken. It's highly selective. You just have a higher standard for connection because your own inner world is already so rich and stimulating. You simply don't need noise to fill the silence.
And if any of this feels familiar, you should know that you're part of a pretty small group. It's estimated to be around 2% of people who operate this way. So you're not alone in feeling this way, you're just, in the minority. And what does being in this group really mean? Well, it means you're driven by a totally different set of values. You inherently prioritize truth over popularity, and deep, genuine authenticity over the fleeting approval of other people. And here is the ultimate gift of being wired this way. Yeah, it might be a lonely path sometimes, but when you finally do find a friend who truly matches your wavelength, that connection will have a depth and a richness that is just, it's far beyond anything a purely surface socialite will ever get to experience. So remember this, that feeling of being an outsider isn't some flaw you need to fix. Your silence isn't a weakness you have to overcome. It is the quiet space where your most profound thoughts and your very best ideas are born. It's your strength.